Thank you very much. And Connor spoke so beautifully slowly, so I'm going to try and do the same. If I start speaking too quickly, tell me to slow down, because when I get enthusiastic, it can get a little out of control. Thank you very much to Klaus and to the rest of the team. It's really great to be here. This is something we have been trying to do for several years, and then pandemics and whatever else got in the way. So it's really great to be here today. And you might think a Viking Ship Museum and the setup you have here at Lauresham, do they have a lot of parallels? Are there many things that relate to each other? And it's been really, really inspiring for me to see that there are actually so many connections, both in the way that we work with experimental archaeology, the way that we work with research, and the kind of dilemmas that we face working in an open air museum environment. So it's really inspiring and interesting to be here. So thank you to Klaus and to the sponsors. The presentation I'm giving today, Skudelev 3, that's the name of the ship that I've been working with for the last 5 to 6 years of my life. And I'm going to talk about 1 ship find, 2 reconstructions, and 40 years of experimental archaeology. So while it's only dealing with 1 ship out of the 5 that we have at the museum, it's really kind of an overview of what has happened at the museum since we started working with experimental archaeology. What you can see here, just about, small map of Denmark up in the corner. If you're familiar with the geography of Denmark, the museum is on the island of Zealand at the bottom of Roskilde Fjord. And for a long time, there had been a tradition that there was a ship out there at the bottom of the fjord, that sometimes fishermen in periods of low, when the water level was quite low, timbers would be seen or they'd catch something in their nets. So they knew for a long time that there was something out there, but everybody thought it was medieval. Nobody thought it was a Viking ship. But what happened in the 1950s was that fishermen were trawling, I don't know how you explain in German, the bottom of the fjord for oyster shells that they were using to make for chicken feed. And this kind of started panicking people who thought there might be an archaeological ship out here. So they decided to carry out an investigation to see, was there anything out there and did it need to be protected? In 1957 to 59, they went out with scuba diving gear in water that was about this deep. So it looked quite dramatic, but wasn't really. And were able to locate the extent of the site just by taking small excavations under the water. And then in 1962, they excavated the whole area here. So what you can just about see, this is a very old aerial photograph, that they built walls all around the site, pumped all of the water out, and started excavating. And what they found were 5 ships. And the reason we call them ship finds rather than shipwrecks is that these aren't ships that got lost in a storm or that sank in a battle or anything like that. They're 5 ships that were intentionally sunk out on the fjord. And the reason they did that, if you can see here and here, these were the main sailing channels on the fjord. And Roskilde at the time in the Viking Age, it was, you can't say it was the capital of Denmark, but it was a very important settlement. And they wanted to control traffic in and out of the fjord, and especially to protect from attack by the sea. So these 5 ships were just literally used to make a barrier. So they blocked these 2 sailing channels and left 1 sailing channel open, but it was a very difficult sailing route. If you weren't a local, you wouldn't be able to navigate through with any kind of large ship at all. So it was a way of kind of closing off the fjord. And they started with 3 ships, this one, and this one. And then about 10, maybe 15 years later, had to build it up again because the ships had fallen apart and the barrier wasn't really working. Then they added 2 more. So for us, it's a really, at the time, it was a sensation in terms of maritime archaeology to find that many ships from the Viking Age at one time. And luckily for us too, and luckily for scholarship in general, it's 5 very different ships. We have 2 cargo ships, 2 warships, and 1 kind of combined fishing transport small cargo ship. So you get that whole picture of the Viking Age. It's not just bearded men with swords off raping and pillaging. It's also to do with long distance trade, local transport, fishing, things like that. And the ship I'm talking about today is this one here, which is found out on the edge of the barrier. And these are some original photographs from after the ships were taken up in 1962. It was an incredible jigsaw puzzle to try and reconstruct, because you can imagine after almost 1,000 years underwater, everything is compressed flat. Timbers have broken up. The tide has moved a lot of the timbers around. So there's around 50,000 different fragments that needed to be taken up, recorded, and then put back together. And the reason I have this picture here you can see the drawing that she's doing. It's because all of the timbers were documented 1-to-1, where there was a sheet of glass and then the timber was put in under, and it was drawn onto kind of plastic foil. It sounds quite primitive when you think of the kind of scanning and everything we can do today. We still use these drawings every day at the boatyard. They are the best documentation. And a large part of that is down to what happens with archaeological timber after it's been taken out of the water, that when it's under the water, it maintains its shape, everything is great. As soon as you take it up and it starts to dry out, it shrinks. So there will always be a degree of deformation, even when it's conserved. As our ships have been, you can't necessarily look at the ships today and go, that's exactly the same shape and size. So these drawings that were made while everything's still wet, just been taken up, that's what we still base our work on today. And this just shows you what it looked like. These are the conservation halls of the Danish National Museum. It was just an enormous warehouse, essentially, of wet timber packed in plastic. And once everything had been documented, she is the most fantastic 60s icon. I love her in the clothes. This is how the wood was conserved. And again, when you find 5 ships like this, you know, this was the biggest timber find that had been made in Denmark, and nobody knew really how do you conserve these the best way. What's the best way to do it? And they tried a lot of different things. They tried using paraffin, linseed oil, alum, but eventually landed on this solution you can see here, which is a substance called polyethylene glycol. It's a kind of a liquid wax. And what they did was to fill giant basins with this and slightly heat it up. And what it starts to do is to replace the water in the timber very gradually, very slowly. So it's quite a, what would you say in English? Non-threatening. I'm really lost on my English, sorry. It's a gentle kind of process for the wood. It doesn't traumatize it too much, but it takes an awfully long time. And especially if you have larger pieces of timber, like you can see here, to be able to get the wax to penetrate all the way into the center takes many, many years. So this was a really long, drawn-out process. Once everything was conserved, then the jigsaw puzzle work began. And this is just to show you kind of the process that was done. You might be able to just see here these small kind of cocktail sticks, small wooden sticks, that most of the planks were broken into many, many small fragments. There were very few that were intact and which survived in that way. So you can see here is when it's drawn, all put together, and then post-conservation, each of the small fragments. And this just shows you how it's all put together. And then you have what looks, when you come and look at the ship today, like an entire plank. So an incredibly detailed and difficult job. And this is the ship that I'm going to talk about today, Skudelev 3. It was the best preserved of the 5 ships. It survives. Around 75% of the ship is left. You can probably just about make out here. And in this image that we're missing the aft, the rear section of the ship. And they think that it probably quite shortly after it landed on the barrier that either the fjord froze and then literally just tore this section of the ship away, or they may actually have removed it intentionally, just chopped it off when it ended on the barrier. But most of the ship very much intact. And this is just what we call a torso drawing. Just to give you an idea, you can see these are all the surviving parts of the ship inside and in profile. So this is what we kind of generally tend to refer to as a trading/transport vessel. It's not a big kind of ocean going, kind of ship you might say to Greenland, North America. And it's a ship for kind of coastal transport around the Danish islands, maybe into the Baltic. It's definitely not a ship for kind of large ocean going voyages or anything like that. It's also not a warship. You might notice here, you have 2 oar holes in this side and not the kind of characteristic row of oar holes that you have on the warship. So it would have a very small crew, maybe 5 to 8 men, and then cargo in the middle of the ship. So it would be used for transporting people, goods, all sorts of different things around the local area, but built in Denmark. It's been dated dendrochronologically to around 1040 and built from Danish oak. Now, when the 5 ships were excavated, they were so well preserved that very quickly people had kind of this dream and this idea of reconstructing them in full scale to try and learn how Viking ships sail, how do they perform. You know, we all know this great story that they sailed all around northwestern Europe and across the Atlantic, but we didn't understand how. You know, how quickly can the ship sail? How much cargo can they carry? All these kinds of questions. So they decided to reconstruct. And the way that we reconstruct and the way that we still do it today is to build a cardboard model. And apologies, it's a very old photograph, it's a little difficult to see. But this is basically one side of the ship, the port side, which has been reconstructed in 1:10 scale. And that's what was used to make the basis for the first reconstruction. And as you can see here, it's literally just half the ship, which is a point we'll get back to later. Because when they tried to gather all of these pieces in a scale model, they couldn't get the two halves of the ship to fit together, basically. Because the port side had survived pretty well intact, and the lines of the ship had survived pretty well. Starboard side, not so much. So it was difficult. They couldn't get it to fit. So they made the decision to literally just make the port side and then just make a match. So they kind of left out half the ship, if you want to say that, or based it on one half of the design. And then we started, or they started, a project to build 4A, as the ship is called. So from 1982 to 1984, that was our first shipbuilding project. And this is the group of young people who built it. And at the time, there was an archaeologist, a naval engineer, a sailing expert, and so on, in the kind of research committee surrounding the project. But the actual building work, they decided at the time that they wanted it to be people who weren't professional boat builders. They're all people who have been involved in other boat building projects. They were sea scouts, experienced sailors, and so on, but not boat builders. And the idea back then in the 80s was that if you had professional craft people, then they would bring their own understanding to it, and they would try and use modern methods, and they wouldn't kind of listen to the archaeological find in the same way. We don't work like that at all today, but I'll get back to that later. So this is the first team that we had. Let's see if I can get this to play. It's just a short clip. And if fashions have also changed a lot at the boatyard since 1982. But essentially, this project was about relearning Viking Age boat building techniques. You know, we still have traditional boat builders in Denmark, excuse me, who build wooden boats, but they work in a very different way. They work with modern tools and saws and so on. So this project was really about learning how to split oak, how to hew planks, how to use Viking Age tools, all those kinds of things that for us are just fundamental knowledge now because it's been handed down to the next generation of craftspeople at the museum. But at the time, it was really revolutionary. And many of this group who built the ship are still employed at the museum today. So we have kind of a very nice, long, unbroken line. And obviously, once the ship is built, the goal is to get it out on the water, to start sailing it, testing it, figuring out how the ship's handled, and to get that kind of detailed, practical understanding of ships and seafaring in the Viking Age. Yes. Viking Age ships are clinker built, which means that the planks overlap each other. On most modern boats, they're built carvel, where the planks are edge to edge. Clinker building, they overlap. And it's a wonderful technology in that you can build a much lighter ship. The planks can be much thinner. It has a flexibility and a strength at the same time. But these overlaps also create a weakness. And it's here that you have a lot of timbers that are lying with their faces together. I'm guessing you have a wooden boat. You're kind of, yes, I understand that prone. And this is it creates some complications. When you have wood in a wet environment where things don't get to dry out, you will invariably end up with rot at some point. And the Vikings did their best to counteract this. You know, the ships are treated with tar and different things to try and prolong the life of the vessel. But at some point, it just becomes an issue and you need to start replacing sections of the ship. And OA was launched in 1982 and some small kind of running repairs up until 2003. You can maybe just see the different color here. That you have lighter planks here at the top, where they had to replace the first two strakes, and also the internal stringers, these reinforcing timbers. And then just pay attention to this young girl here, because she shows up again another couple of years in the life of the ship. So that was the first major repair. And in 2013, more repairs again. Again, you can see the freshly tarred timber as opposed to many years of tar. And this is quite simply just due to rot that starts to appear in these kind of overlaps. And if you don't take it out, it will literally just spread to the entire ship. So they try to take a section at a time and deal with it that way. Every year. Yeah, we take them out of the water in the autumn and then they're kept on the land for the winter and then scraped and retarred and launched again. 2014, in my opinion, this was a repair too far. That at this stage, this is meant to be an archaeological experiment, teaching us about Viking ships. I have a hard time thinking that Vikings would have repaired an old vessel to the extent that the ship was repaired here. You can see it's a pretty extensive repair. This is looking into the hull. So a lot of the side planking has been taken off and replaced. You can see it a little better here. And it's always a dilemma, again, when you work in an open air museum. Finances aren't endless. You have a very limited budget to work with. And when you have a reconstruction like this, which is important and which is an integral part of the research at the museum, when do you stop repairing? When do you stop prolonging? And so this repair was carried out in 2014, but sadly didn't really prolong the life of the ship at all. In 2016, this is the situation below the waterline. And what you can see here are the iron rivets that hold the planks together, or what you can see is the rust where the rivets are sitting. And what happens when these rivets rust is they expand and they crack the planks. And you don't need to be Einstein to realize that cracked planking below the waterline is not what you want on the ship. So at this stage in 2016, again, looking at the state of the hull, it was either repair the entire bottom of the ship or give up. So the decision was made to give up and retire the ship on land. So from the launch of the ship in 84 until retirement on land, a lifespan of 32 years, which seems to tie in quite nicely with the dating that we have for the original ships, that they seem to have been in use for around 30, perhaps 40 years, but not more than that. And an important part of our work with experimental archaeology and with building ships is to get an understanding of material use in the Viking Age. This is a period when you had hundreds, if not thousands, of ships on the water, and what kind of demand did that put on the local society, on the landscape? In order to have this amount of material to work with, are we looking at early evidence for forest management, control of resources, all that kind of thing? So this is what we call our service book, where we just literally note everything every time something is replaced and repaired, why it's repaired and how, and so on. So we have this kind of life story or biography for each of our ships. And this is just the planking material from the original ship, Skudelev 3. And the red colours you can see here, that's original wood from when it was built. And the purple are the sections of timber that have been replaced on the original ship. So on the original, it was mostly prepared below the waterline. Whereas on OA, the green timbers you can see here are what we have replaced. So we have a completely opposite situation. That we have some damage below the waterline, but it's predominantly the planking. This is the planking just kind of folded out. So most of our damage is above the waterline due to the rot, which I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture. And we still don't really understand why. That is, obviously we're doing something that they didn't do in the Viking Age. We handle our ships very differently. In the Viking Age, ships weren't just lying in a harbour a whole summer. It seems most likely they were put in water, and when they weren't in use, they were pulled up again. But you can always see the keel is very worn underneath from being pulled up and put in the water again and again. We don't do that. That has something to do with it. Could it be something to do with pollution in the water? All sorts of questions. Or is it something to do with maintenance that we're just not quite understanding the ways in which we need to maintain and take care of the ship? So we're still working on trying to understand why those two diagrams are so different. And I mentioned earlier this whole issue of materials. You can just about see here that it took 54 cubic meters of oak to build the ship. And this again is quite a tricky or a hot topic these days, when people don't want forests to be felled and they want the big oak trees to be kept in the forest. For us as a museum, we can be quite unpopular going out and felling trees and so on. And it gives you an idea again, that to build a ship like this or to build a war fleet, it takes a huge amount of material, that it's not just a couple of planks that are put together. It's many, many trees that go into building a ship like that. So around 54 cubic meters to build it. And you really can't see that one, 13.8 cubic meters to maintain it. So in terms of replacing all the planking material that we did. So it's actually a fairly labor intensive and material heavy thing to try and keep these planks, to keep the ships maintained and to keep them sailing. One very interesting aspect though, the 4A was equipped with a hand-woven wool sail, same sail that the ship used in all the years it was on the water, and that sail is still in good condition. So we've actually made the decision that we're going to reuse it on the new ship, because it would be really interesting for us to know exactly how long can a Viking Age sail survive. Because if you think about how these sails are manufactured, all of the wool is being spun by hand with a drop spindle. There's no spinning wheel, hand woven, and then it's impregnated with mixtures of fat and ochre. And probably time-wise, takes the same amount of time to make a sail as it takes to build a boat. So this is giving us an interesting insight into that kind of balance between textile industry and boat building industry, and the way in which the two are completely interrelated. And could it perhaps be that if you had a ship like Hawaii, which was retired, but you had a sail that fit, would you then go to the boat builder and say, just build another one same size because this sail fits? Or would you, could the sail be given to someone else, modified, cut down, reused? So we're really looking forward to using that sail again for the next couple of years. And Hawaii has been a really important ship for us in terms of understanding Viking Age ships. Until that ship was built, everybody thought that Viking Age ships could basically only sail when they had the wind behind them. This diagram you can see here, it's from tests that were done with Hawaii in white, with a modern sailing boat in yellow, and with a traditional Norwegian boat in green, all sailing the same course and in the same wind conditions. And you can see that the ships can actually, in these square-sailed ships, they're able to make to sail against the wind, that they have a much more complex kind of sail handling than people have thought before. So very well developed and effective vessels. So it's taught us how they sailed, given an insight into material, and then also kind of laid the foundation for the projects that came afterwards once we had finished this ship. But now the ship had been retired, and we decided, well, what do we do? Because we always have this kind of principle at the museum that the 5 shipwrecks are best understood when we have a full-scale reconstruction in the harbour, on the water, that people can sail with. So we knew we wanted to build it again, and had a lot of different reasons for doing so. That, well, it's experimental archaeology. The more you do it, the better you get. And it is a kind of a principle that experiments should be repeated. So that was the one. Another one was to kind of test ourselves, that we had built and reconstructed a lot of ships in between in the 35 years from when Hawaii was built. Had we gotten better? Could we build a more accurate reconstruction of the ship? And also just to evaluate our own practice and how we work at the museum, to explore craft knowledge, how we study it, how we disseminate it, but perhaps most importantly, to continue the sailing experiment. Because while Hawaii has sailed a lot and we've gotten a lot of interesting data out of it, we've never tried sailing with it as a cargo ship. So we don't really understand how it functioned in the late Viking Age. And also to continue our work with Viking Age sails. So in 2017, we started again with a new reconstruction model. And here you can kind of see the process, how it works. These are the original documentation drawings that I talked about in the beginning, scaled down to 1:10. And the way they do it is to glue it onto cardboard. And it sounds, again, very primitive. Why use cardboard when you could use a computer model? But with cardboard, at the scale of 1:10, it kind of matches the properties of oak. Because the problem with most computer programs, even still today, if you wanted to use them for reconstruction, you can force them to do anything if you ask them to. Whereas physical materials, they have a limit. You can only bend them so much, twist them so much. So it gives you a more accurate picture, we believe. We get a lot of criticism for this from the more digital maritime people who would rather work exclusively with digital models. So the way that Vibeke Bischoff in the picture here, she's our ship reconstructor. She starts with the keel and the stems, and it just basically replicates the boat building process. Put on the first garboards, the planks, build it up with each consecutive plank. And then these small little pins you can see here. The way that she knows she has the right shape is because the pin, or each of these pins goes through a rivet hole, which is marked on the drawing. So we know that it's the original rivet holes that overlap, so that the form is kind of guided by the find. And then once she has a number of planks on, she starts putting in these floor timbers, excuse me, kind of the ribs of the vessel. And that's what starts to stiffen it up and give it a shape. And then she just continues with all of the elements. And what happened with this model, in contrast to the one in 1982, was she was able to get it to all fit. She was able to get all of the pieces in together. And that's in a way partly due to her own skills. She's also a boat builder, so she has a great amount of understanding for this, but also because she could see that some of the drawings, which they had tried to scale down in 1982, they had gotten the measurements a little bit wrong, that it was done by photographing from a height. So there was a bit of deformation, and being able to correct that in Photoshop meant that she was able to get a more accurate image. So even though I just said we don't use digital methods in reconstruction, we do use them to help us. And here you can see the difference. So we basically have two different ship forms. A little hard to see maybe, but the red ship is 4A and the black is the new one. And the main difference is, as you can see, it's slightly wider, but the black extends a little further out. But the most significant change is here. A little difficult to see, but on the red one, the keel only goes to here. On the black one, it's further down. So it basically sticks deeper into the water than 4A did. And this is what we're most excited about, because it will potentially have an impact on how the ship can be handled, how you can turn the ship, and we hope make it a better vessel than the one we had before. So in May 2017, we started to build it again. Bye-bye. And this is the two boat builders who are working on the project, looking at
still just it's her slide, so when she's finished
it gives you an idea of the kind of amount of materials involved. And that was the project that initially was supposed to run for 2 years, and then became 3, and then the pandemic came, so it got extended a lot. So we didn't actually launch the boat until May of 2022. Got it in the water, and unfortunately didn't manage to get it rigged up last summer. So it's only this summer now that we're starting to get the rigging and the sail on and start these new experiments. But when we do it again, what do we do differently? You know, we get asked this a lot, especially from the locals around the museum, that, oh, you're building another ship. Why? You know, what are we getting out of it? And it's really been a good chance for us to kind of reflect on how we work and what has changed. And just in contrast to the picture I showed you in the beginning of these young non-boat builders, all the people you can see here in the image are not me, obviously I'm the archaeologist in the middle, but everyone else is working professionally with boat building. We have some of our education and outreach people there too, and also Vivek, who does the reconstruction. We would never today build with inexperienced people, mostly because I think we've kind of realized that it is possible to leave your modern preconceptions at the door, and that the kind of skill that they bring to the table in terms of understanding materials, tools, all that kind of thing, it absolutely outweighs any risk that you might have of misinterpreting a find. So today we have probably the biggest collection of Viking Age boat builders in the world working at our museum. And as I said before, now we're kind of moving on to the second generation, both of researchers and of boat builders. And it's a really great thing to be able to just go in and ask a question. Hey, how did you guys do this when you built this ship or that ship? And to be able to have that dialogue and to develop all the time. Another thing we do differently, this is also something Klaus and I have discussed a little the last few days. This very obviously wasn't cut using an axe. In the beginning, it was quite kind of fundamental. It should be Viking Age tools only, because that's how we do it best and how we learn best. And that is true in the beginning, but at some point you reach a stage where you're fluent enough with the tools to not have to do it that way every time. One reason for this is just physical breakdown. As I mentioned, we have boat builders who've been building Viking ships for 30 years. If you work with an axe exclusively for 30 years, you retire early because they get problems with their wrists, their shoulders. It's just not sustainable. So part of it is kind of an acknowledgement that we would like to maintain our staff. We'd like to not break them while they're working for the sake of building Viking ships. Another thing is that it depends on the focus of the project. You know, for us with this ship, the main research focus is getting it out on the water and sailing it. So the fact that we used a saw to take a piece of this log, which will become the stem, has zero impact on that research result at all. So we have kind of made peace with the fact that we use modern tools now and again, and guests understand that when they get it explained. You know, it's really obvious when you look at them working with the axe. It's really bloody hard work. And another thing too is that, you know, if you have like this a stem which is going to sit in a log like that, if you take the whole thing out with an axe, it's incredibly wasteful. Everything just ends as small wood chips on the ground. If we can cut larger sections off, we can use that in other projects, use them on other parts of the boat and so on. So it's also a more sustainable way of working. Another thing we do differently is the type of axes that we work with. On the first project, these broad-bladed axes were used a lot for hewing the planks. They've been found archaeologically. You see them on the Bayeux tapestry. The problem is that we have no evidence for them in the tool marks found on the ships. So we have used them a lot before, as you can see from the photograph, but we decided on this building project that they were only going to use the type of tools that they found, found evidence for. So now they use a different, much smaller, it's kind of difficult to see here, but a right angled axe, as we call it. It's got a much shorter blade, and it just kind of pushed the boat builders to think in a different way, to work in a different way. Like initially, they're so used to using these broad bladed axes because they're just incredibly effective, but they found that they can get pretty much the same result using the other axe once they get into the kind of rhythm of working with it. So that's kind of another layer being built on to our understanding. Another very big difference, this clearly isn't an iron rivet, this is a copper rivet. And we mentioned earlier the kind of damage that we had on the ship due to the rust. Once it was taken on land, we had a lot of kind of discussions back and forth. And should we build again with oak? What should we do? Or with iron? Should we go over to copper? What can we do? And eventually the decision landed on copper. This is nothing you would ever have seen in a Viking Age ship. They would never have used copper rivets. But for us, we've kind of reached the point where, number one, it's an incredible economic burden to have to keep changing several thousand rivets every winter. It's also time consuming. It takes time away from other projects, having to just keep repairing every winter. It uses a lot of oak when we have to keep replacing planks that have been cracked. Again, expensive, but also wasteful. And it's basically the main kind of argument for us, and the one that has the most impact on the research, is that we've now reconstructed all 5 of the ships that were discovered. We've followed them from the beginning to their retirement. So far, we've only retired 1, but the rest will be retiring within the next 10 years or so. So we have that full life cycle. We don't need to focus on that again. So this time, with the next generation of ships that we build, the focus is on sailing, on understanding how they're used, all that more kind of practical insight. And by building with copper, we get a ship that's going to last a lot longer, can have many more years on the water, and one that we can get more research data out of. So that's our arguments. Another thing we did differently is, how to describe that? When they built 4A, although they weren't boat builders, they had this kind of tendency or obsession with making all the lines straight. And what's interesting with a lot of these ship finds are that they don't necessarily follow straight lines. But they thought that, if there was a line on the original ship that was a little uneven, if they had had a better piece of timber, they would have made it straight. So they made 4A completely linear and perfect, but it doesn't reflect the actual find. So when we built this ship, we went back to the original material, and you can see one of the boat builders here. He's looking at the documentation drawings from the original ship while making this small clamp here. And this is a really difficult thing for a modern boat builder, actually, to make something. You can't call it bad, but it's certainly not completely even. You can just about see in here that these curves are just a little on the wonky side. You've got a curve here that travels up and down, and also a surface that's quite rough and uneven. But all of these things, they reflect the original ship better. And it gives us an insight into the way that they were working, that they weren't necessarily obsessed with things being perfect or straight. They would make the best of the materials that they had. And that's why you start to see some of these uneven lines. Other things, again, a little difficult to see, but this curve, this one runs from the corner and down. This one doesn't. It kind of starts in the middle and runs down. So it's not symmetrical. We don't know why they made it that way. It looks really wonky. And you kind of want the curve to continue to the corner, but it doesn't. And that's a really interesting challenge for craftsmen to replicate something when you have a desire to just make it match, but you can't. So that's kind of forced them to think a lot more about how Viking Age boat builders work, that they weren't necessarily obsessed with perfection. They did the best of what they had, and that they were, sometimes happy to just stop when things were okay, good enough, rather than completely and utterly perfect. Another thing we do differently now, and this is a photograph from the start of the project, where when working with some of the planking on the ship, you have a lot of very extreme curves, and that can be quite difficult to achieve when you're working with oak. A modern day boat builder would throw it into a steam chest where it would be heated up. So the lignin in the wood gets soft and you can kind of pull and twist the oak in different ways. We made a kind of Viking age version, if you want to call it that, where there's a fire. And then if you just keep by heating it, it has the same effect, that the kind of steam goes into the oak and makes it pliable. And then you can put it onto the ship and pull it into the position that you need. But what we found over the course of the building project, and again, due to their confidence in their ability and their understanding of the materials, that we didn't have to do that at all. It looks a bit chaotic here, but what you can see, these plank levers that are tied to the ground. So they would essentially get the oak into position and then pushing it in some places, pulling it in others, that you can make it do the same thing as a steel bend plank. And you just have to be more patient. It takes a few days for the oak to kind of, okay, this is my position now. And then you can take it down and work it some more, put it back up, let it sit another few days, take it down. So that was another kind of step closer, I would say, to Viking age boat building than we had done with previous projects.
Andy's not in his shorts.
And what's going to happen now? As I said, in May, we're going to start rigging the ship up. So getting the mast on, getting all the rope work finished, getting the sail on. And around mid-June, we're going to start sailing it in. That's where you kind of establish the ship's sailing capabilities. What does trim, how much ballast does it need to have, and so on. And then from summer 23, there's a new volunteer boat guild who've taken over the ship, and they'll be having their first summer voyage. And then from next year on, we'll be starting more controlled test sailing, and then obviously, hopefully at some point, publishing and disseminating the results of all of this, both the building project and the sailing. And you can follow all of our work online if you're interested on both Facebook, Instagram, and the website. And otherwise, I would just like to say thank you.
It's not at the moment.
This thanks
Lauresham Open Air Laboratory.
Thank you, Triona, for this certainly very interesting, insightful and beautiful presentation. And you do great work there. It's really great to cooperate with you in that way. The floor is open for questions. Any questions, please?
I'm not sure if I get it right. You have rebuilt all the 5?
all
ships?
5,
Is it
yes.
5?
Some of them twice, yeah.
Okay, and you sailed all of them?
Yeah. Yeah.
So also the big one.
Also the big one, yeah, that's how, I'm Irish originally, but I sailed the big one, Sea Stallion, to Denmark, so no, from Denmark to Dublin and back again, and met a Dane and ended up moving over. So we've we've done them all, and not all of the ships have been on longer voyages. Sea Stallion, which you can see here in the photo, has obviously been to Ireland and back. It's been to Germany, been to Norway, Sweden. We also have a large Knar, a large cargo vessel that's been to Scotland, various trips around the Baltic. The smaller, more coastal ships, strangely enough, stay quite close to home. But we have a lot of trips we haven't done yet. We haven't done a huge amount of work around the Baltic. Just before the war in Ukraine started, we had a project where one of our ships was supposed to travel down the river systems to see how far that could have gone. We've never gone over the North Atlantic. So we have a lot of dreams ahead of us still. We just need ships that aren't rusting and falling apart.
And what was your experience with the port ships sailing in the ocean?
Ooh, that might take a while. It was incredible. They're so much better built than you give them credit for. You know, it's an open ship and it doesn't have a huge amount of freeboard, you know, the distance between the water and the top of the ship. So they look quite vulnerable. But we had a few episodes where we sailed into really, really bad weather, not intentionally, with Sea Stallion when we were traveling from Scotland to the Isle of Man, and ended up in 4-meter high waves and winds of 32 meters a second and things like that. And so everyone had survival suits on, and yeah, we're pretty much ready for the ship to just keel over and sink. But it didn't. It was incredibly seaworthy. And even though we lost steering at one point in that storm, the connecting rope that holds the rudder onto the ship, it broke, which is a really bad thing to happen on a ship, because then it will just go sideways to the waves, and that's when you sink. But every time these big waves came in, you'd see them coming and just think, oh, this is it. And then the ship just went up the front of the wave and just down the back again, really gently. So still mildly terrifying, but after the first 3 or 4, you just knew, okay, just hold on. And it was fun. And that once we got the sail up again, just away. So they knew exactly what they were doing. It gives you a lot of respect for their skill. Yeah.
I'll stick with my oxen. A lot of respect.
Hmm.
Any further questions? You have one.
Yeah, just as you were saying, it seems like they knew how to build boats.
Mm.
Do you know why they opted for iron bolts if they are causing cracks and copper? Why didn't?
Yeah, it is kind of a funny one because you do have copper fastenings and bronze actually in the Mediterranean at the same period, but in the north and in Europe, it's predominantly iron. We think, or we're starting to suspect, that there's something locally in the area of Skudelev that's causing us problems, because there are other Viking age ships, reconstructions in Denmark built with iron that don't rust nearly as quickly as ours do. So it could be pollution, it could be that we're too close to the modern harbour next door, where there's a lot of ships with batteries under the water, which causes all sorts of problems with the galvanic connections under the water. And we do seem to be particularly vulnerable to this, and we still don't understand why. So it's something we're trying to get to the bottom of all the time, because we have our reasons for building with copper. We'd still rather build with iron if we could. Yeah.
May I?
Yeah.
Well, then you. Okay. I have a question about the sails. When it comes to archaeological evidence of sails, are there any?
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the best we have is on the Osberg ship from Norway. They found a lot of textile on the ship, but there's still kind of discussion back and forth. Was it a sail? Was it a tent? We don't know. So it's really, it's one of the big kind of open-ended questions. We have a lot of kind of indirect evidence for the sails that on not all the ships, but some of them you have the holes that were used for the rigging. So you get some information about how wide the sail could have been. We don't know how high they were. We don't have any intact mast from the Viking age. And a lot of people think we over rig our ships, that we make the mast too high and the sail too high. So there's a lot of things we don't know, and most of the sails we think or assume would have been of wool, but we haven't sailed with wool sails on all of our ships. Again, the question of economics and so on. So Sea Stallion, for example, has a linen sail. So it's a field of research that we've kind of tipped the surface of, but there's a lot more work to do there for sure.
Yeah, do you know how many projects like this exist worldwide? For example, I visited Oslo last year, and there's the project you mentioned a few seconds ago. Are
there's not
many?
All that many. I mean, there's probably, within Denmark, we're really the only ones building ship reconstructions at that scale. And then in Norway, they focus pretty much on the Osberg ship, and they're now starting a new reconstruction of the Goksel ship as well. And then they built the Dragon Harald Fairhair, some of you may have heard of, which is a reconstruction, which is even bigger than Sea Stallion. And, you know, most archaeologists would just say it's a fantasy ship that sailed from Norway to America and is currently on tour over there. And then you do have some projects, like there's been, we had a project several years ago where we made working drawings available for free for a smaller boat, a 7-meter long boat. And a lot of people have actually built that. And there's been some projects in Estonia, for example, where they did it completely authentically more than we do. You know, they smelted the iron, made their own rivets, used lime bass for the rope, hand wove a sail. So there are a lot of small projects going on, but in terms of big organizations, there's not many, and we should support each other more than we do.
Yeah.
But you find anything out about where the wood, the original wood came from? Was it from the area up there, or was it further away?
It's difficult. I mean, we can kind of say Denmark, kind of in inverted commas, it's somewhere within the Danish region, but at the time, and in terms of dendro dating, southern Sweden could probably almost be nearly the same. You know, that it can be quite difficult to precisely locate, and it depends on the quality of the sampling. That the original ship Skudelev 2, which is the warship, they were able to pinpoint that precisely to the year 1042 on the east coast of Ireland. So sometimes you can be lucky, sometimes not. And our main problem is that 2 of our ships are built from pine, and the dendro curves just aren't as well established for pine as they are for oak. So it's a little bit open, but we're kind of hoping maybe a DNA at some point might start shedding some light on wood, or that if we just, again, you know, it's a long time since these ships were dendro dated, if we get a modern specialist to look at them again, that we might be able to get better information out of that.
Yes.
After that amount of ships you have to, do you think, oh, now we know how they have done it, or do you think yes, we can do it, but we're not quite sure if they have done it in the same way.
That's the thing, and it's kind of the paradox, I guess, for you too, that when you work with reconstruction, that you're using craft techniques that are similar, but because you have to match the exact measurements of an archaeological find, you have to use modern control. So while we have built many Viking ships, we have never ever built a ship as they would have done, because one of the boat builders, the guy you saw looking at the drawings at the end, is from the Faroe Islands, and he's one of the last remaining boat builders in Europe who was trained to draw or to build by eye. He doesn't know how to work from a working drawing. He's just trained to look at it, and he has a series of kind of measurement ratios in his head from which he builds. Of course, he can follow working drawings at the museum, but it's just a completely different tradition. And it's much closer to how they would have done it. This wasn't a written society, you know, so it would have been through experience, learning from one generation to the next. And we really would love to do a project. We've been talking about it for years. At some point when we try to build as they would have done, it won't be a reconstruction, but it will be about reconstructing a process. And to just say, okay, you have 3 oak logs, 2 bits of pine, build me a 4-meter long boat that I want to use for fishing, and you need to be able to have 1 sail, and it should be able to travel around the fjord. You know, that's how boat building was done until the 1950s, that it was based on the requirements of the owner, what they wanted it for, and the waters it was going to sail in. And the boat builders would love to do that, to, you know, to make a model, to look at the material and just build it, you know, because all the techniques in terms of, you know, shaping, fastening, they can do it in their sleep. But this whole process of thinking a boat before you build it, that's something they'd love to try, or we'd love to try. So we hope at some point in the future to do it.
I mean, sometimes the travel is the finish line at the same time as the experience is what really is what we're lacking of. So if we do it 40, 50, 60, 70 years, we will still learn and make the whole getting closer to the original process more authentic, learn more. And it's the same with our Origin Furrow project. Now, after 10 years, we start to glimpse details that we never thought of. Now it really starts to make sense. And now we say, okay, now we can talk about experimental archaeology. Before that, it was gaining experience, which is 100% as valuable as the experiment, but it's a pre-measure you have to take.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody, for the lively discussion, and thanks again to both of you for your talks. And I wish you a good stay still at the Open Air Lab for a couple more hours, and a good Sunday. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.